The topic is the latest ruling on the U.S. Department of Defense ban on 5G technology from China's Huawei and ZTE. I'm speaking with Alex Soria. He is a member of the litigation practice of Miller and Chevalier. Alex, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Robert.
So I'd like you to explain for our viewers, there's this new second interim rule that's come out with regard to Huawei and ZTE, but maybe we can start by telling us what was the first interim rule from US DoD, what did that say, and then by association, what's the second rule mean?
Sure. So all of this, both interim rules, emanate from Section 889 of the fiscal year 2019 National Defense Authorization Act. And that statute is the primary vehicle by which Congress funds the procurement activities of the Department of Defense, but it's also the primary vehicle by which Congress enacts new procurement regulatory type activities, so procurement policy essentially. And so way back in 2018, late 2018, the fiscal year 19 NDAA contained Section 889, which required the FAR Council, Federal Acquisition Regulation Council, to promulgate new rules implementing the Section 889 ban. And the Section 889 contains two parts, Part A and Part B. The first set of regulations was issued in August of 2019, and that implements Part A, which prohibits contractors from selling directly to U.S. federal agencies any equipment, systems, or services that use covered telecommunications equipment or services as either a substantial or essential component or as a critical technology.
Just to stop you for a moment, you said all federal agencies, not just defense-oriented?
Correct.
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's okay. And so the focus of Part A, which has been in effect, the implementing regulations were issued in August of 2019, so it's been in effect for quite some time now. The thrust of the Part A regulations is it's really a procurement ban. It prohibits the government, federal agencies from directly purchasing equipment, systems, or services that may incorporate components from companies like Huawei, ZTE, Dahua, Hikvision, et cetera. The Part A regulations, Part B regulations, which were most recently promulgated in July of 2020 and went into effect on August 13th, 2020, those implement Part B, and they are broader than the Part A regulations in the sense that they regulate not just what federal agencies are procuring directly from contractors, but they are regulating the types of companies that the U.S. federal government is allowed to do business with. And so the Part B regulations look to whether or not an agency is entering into a contract or extending an existing contract with any entity that uses equipment, systems, or services that use covered telecommunications equipment or services as a substantial or essential component or critical technology. So again, Part A is very much focused on what the government is buying. Part B is very much focused on who are we doing business with and are they using covered telecommunications equipment or services within their internal operations.
Further puts suppliers to federal agencies in quite a bind, I would think, in terms of, I guess, to what extent are they incorporating this technology already in their products, and let alone the new 5G stuff that's coming out now. Does this really, does this represent a huge portion of their technology? Are they having to is it a big impact on them?
It really depends on the industry, depends on the contractor. Many government contractors where government contracting is their primary business. So think of the Lockheeds, the Raytheons of the world. They've been ahead of the curve on this issue, I would imagine, for quite some time, in the sense that they know and understand that their primary source of revenue is the U.S. government and U.S. government contracting. So for companies like that, I would imagine these regulations present some challenges. The Part B regulations present some challenges in terms of regulating their supply chain and understanding who they are doing business with and how those entities may be incorporating these components into the products and services that they sell up the chain. But for the most part, with the passage of the National Defense Authorization Act in late 2018, I would imagine those traditional government contractors have been up to speed on these issues for quite some time and are probably not feeling the sting as much as some other contractors. And
Hmm.
those contractors really, at least based on our experience in advising clients on this, tend to fall into, a couple of different categories, but primarily companies that have both government contracting business and, traditionally commercial operations. So they are dual hatted, they do both. And for companies like that, particularly multinational companies who have operations in many different parts of the world, the Part B regulations, to your point, really are presenting pretty significant challenges, because at the end of the day, the rule doesn't divide the world into use of these covered telecommunications equipment or services with respect to your government contracts business. They
Hmm.
are looking much more broadly as to any use, regardless of its connection to your
Yeah.
government contracts business.
What is SAM representation?
SAM is the System for Award Management, and it's a database that's maintained by the US government. Requires any company that wants to be eligible to compete for US government contracts to register with the US government and provide some basic information about who they are, their nature of their business, the type of industry that they work in.
Hmm.
As part of your SAM registration, and why that's relevant here, uh, companies are also required to make certain annual representations and certifications to the government. So when you are registering for SAM or renewing your registration in SAM, part of that exercise entails walking through a series of federal acquisition regulation clauses that, as an offeror or a potential offeror, you need to certify by clicking, literally clicking boxes indicating to the government and representing to the government that you are in compliance with those federal acquisition regulation clauses, and that you will continue to be in compliance with them going forward.
Hmm.
Why that's relevant here, of course, is that in the implementation of Part A and Part B of Section 889, these implementing regulations prescribe new FAR clauses or prescribe updated FAR clauses that soon will be included as part of the SAM registration list of contract clauses that contractors will have to click through and represent that they comply with.
Hmm. What are some of the challenges? You indicated that some companies are already up to speed, especially with the first rule that came out. Are there continuing challenges in terms of complying with these new rules and indeed determining whether, in fact, their technology does incorporate any components from these targeted Chinese suppliers and Russian suppliers?
Yeah, I'll start with, sort of the theoretical concerns, and then go to some practical concerns. So, the theoretical concern, when many companies that we're working with look at the regulations, particularly the Part B regulations, one question that comes up at time and again is, what does use mean? What does it actually mean to use equipment, systems, or services that incorporate these banned Chinese technologies? And that's presenting a real challenge, because, as I alluded to earlier, you're talking about multinational companies with, in many instances, footprints all over the world, including in parts of the world where the types of technologies that we're talking about here, the type of technology that's actually regulated under these provisions, that technology is ubiquitous in certain parts of the world. For example, in Southeast Asia, particularly in China, where lots of companies have their own commercial operations and pretty significant operations. And so one challenge for many companies is really understanding the type of use and by which corporate entity within their overarching structure needs to be in compliance with these regulations in order for the contracting entity to ultimately make the representation.
Hmm.
So that's a bit of a theoretical concern, but it's one that is very real for many companies who are
Yeah.
operating in this space.
Well, if you have
Um,
complex operations all over the world, it's not just then product content you have to determine, it's actually all those different subsidiaries and different partners in your supply chain. Make sure they're not using it too. That sounds like a huge challenge even now going
That,
forward.
that's that's exactly right, and one thing to keep in mind here, Part B, especially as the broader of the two regulatory frameworks here, it requires a representation by the legal entity that is contracting directly with the federal government. So many companies, even those multinationals, are set up in a way where the contracting entity is a U.S. based entity, for example, or a Canadian based entity. that has already taken steps to determine, where it is sourcing from, and maybe firewalled or ring-tailed around certain systems to ensure that their corporate or commercial operations in parts of the world like China or India or other parts of Asia are physically separated from the US contracting business. The challenge that we've seen come up for many companies that fall into this category is things like intercompany sales. So if the Chinese entity is selling to the U.S. entity, and that U.S. entity happens to be contracting with the U.S. government, query whether the sale from the Chinese entity is carrying with it some of these banned components that the U.S. entity up until this point has simply never detected or never worried about. So that's one big concern. The other one is the one you allude to, and that's really I think the most practical challenge for most U.S. government contractors right now under Part B, and that's really understanding, the equipment, systems, and services that you are procuring from external sources like subcontractors, suppliers, vendors. Are those equipment, systems, and services, are they actually covered telecommunications equipment or services? Many companies might say, well, we know whether or not we are sourcing from Huawei or from ZTE or from some sort of provider that is distributing those products. That's easy enough to tell because it can be determined by, in many instances, by taking a look at your internal purchasing systems and looking for those buzzwords. The more challenging part of it is if you are sourcing particularly from other parts of the world, a piece of equipment that you have no idea whether any of its component parts are coming from or being sourced from one of these 5 Chinese telecommunications companies. And so as a practical matter, the position that prime contractors, these legal entities that are required to make the representation, the position they're being put in now is to really quickly pivot to their supply chain. One, determine what parts of their supply chain present the biggest risk for purposes of conducting a reasonable inquiry into whether or not they use covered telecommunications equipment. So figuring out the suppliers that present the biggest risk, and then going to those suppliers and asking them, hey, are the equipment, systems, or services that you are selling to me, do you know whether or not they incorporate or they use or rely on covered telecommunications equipment or services? And in many instances, that sets off a chain of events, of course, that we're all familiar with in the world of supply chains. That vendor, that immediate vendor, the first-tier supplier, may say, well, gee, I am familiar generally with the components that are included in the product that I sell to you, prime contractor, but I need to check with my supplier, and potentially that supplier needs to check with its supplier. And so one of the concerns here as a practical matter is that you're putting prime contractors, U.S. prime contractors, in a position of making representations as of August 13th. So this has been going on now for a month. When it comes to the Department of Defense, those representations will be required as of September 30th, when the Department of Defense's temporary waiver expires. But contractors in real time are being asked to make these representations by the U.S. government, when that entire process that I just described about querying their supply chain is playing out and could play out over an extended period of time. And so the real challenge here, frankly, for most companies is a logistical one. It's really setting up a compliance program from scratch, making sure that you've got the appropriate resources in place to be able to manage it, but then also making sure that you don't miss something, or that if you did miss something, you can quickly turn to the government, let them know what you missed, and tell them how you're going to fix it. That takes a lot of effort on behalf of these companies.
Yeah, boy, a lot for these companies to think about. But Alex Soria, thank you so much for laying it out for us, just what the challenge is for companies that are seeking to comply with these government procurement rules. So thank you very much for being with us today. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Robert. Thanks.